In this video, we're going to cover protection paladins. Let's start by talking about how to gear your paladin. Let's start by looking at stats and reforging. As you can see from the stats equation, mastery and stamina are the most important stats, followed by parry and dodge. Let's take a look at reforging. If you're having problems holding aggro, increase your expertise and hit rating until you find that your threat generation is okay. After that, focus on maximizing mastery. Reforge parry and dodge into mastery. Let's take a look at some useful gems that you can use to socket your gear as a protection paladin. You can see a list of the most relevant gems. I'll give you a moment to look that over. Now, when gemming your gear, if the socket bonus is plus 15 for any stat other than haste, or if the socket bonus is mastery, then it's worthwhile to match the sockets. Otherwise, use straight mastery gems. They're called fractured amber jewels. Let's take a look at some useful glyphs for protection paladins. You can see on the screen right now a list of effective prime glyphs and a list of effective major glyphs. Let's talk about the glyphs that I chose for this particular paladin. The prime glyphs that you want to go with, the main ones that I usually go with are the Shield of the Righteous glyph, the Hammer of the Righteous glyph. These are primarily beneficial for threat generation. This is for single target threat generation, and this is AoE threat generation. And the last one that's important is the Glyph of Seal of Truth, because it increases your expertise while it's active. Now, expertise, as we discussed earlier in the stats section, actually helps you generate more threat because you aren't dodged or parried. So it's beneficial in that sense. Now the major glyphs, I did some research on major glyphs and just about all of them are preferential. It really just comes down to personal preference. I went with the Glyph of Holy Wrath, Glyph of Consecration, and the Glyph of Divine Plea. I really like the Glyph of Divine Plea. And let's briefly talk about the minor glyphs. The reason why I went with these two, these are the ones worth mentioning, is because sometimes in combat I'll switch between Glyph of Insight and Glyph of Truth, and it's just a lot nicer if I can do that and it doesn't cost as much mana. Let's take a look at some of the more useful protection paladin talents. Now, as with the other talent discussions with the other videos, we're not going to talk about every individual talent in gross detail. Instead, we'll just talk about the most important ones. Let's start by taking a look at a couple of interesting debuffing talents, starting with Judgments of the Just. What this does is anytime you cast Judgment, it reduces the target's melee and ranged attack speed by 20%. This is similar to other tanking classes. For example, warriors have Thunderclap that reduces attack speed by 20%, and Death Knights have Icy Touch, which does the same thing. Let's take a look at the other debuffing talent, which is Vindication. The way this works is anytime you use Crusader Strike or Hammer of the Righteous, it reduces the physical damage done by their primary targets by 10%. So this is a nice combination of talents to have. Toughness is an absolutely essential talent to have. It increases your armor value by 10%, thereby increasing your damage mitigation. Hallowed Ground, I didn't spend 2 talent points in this talent, but it really makes your consecration cost a lot less mana and increases its damage done. The reason why I didn't spend talents here is because I did some research and it does very little damage and generates very little threat. Sanctuary is an essential tanking talent because it makes you uncrittable. As you can see from the description, it says, reduces the chance you'll be critically hit by melee attacks by 6%, and reduces all damage taken by 10%. In addition, when you block or dodge a melee attack, you gain 3% of maximum mana, so it has a lot of really useful properties for a tank. Hammer of the Righteous is an absolutely essential protection paladin tanking ability. It's an area effect ability that generates 1 holy power charge when you use it. The other awesome thing about it is it hits every target within 8 yards for a small amount of holy damage. We'll talk about how Hammer of the Righteous fits into the AoE rotation later in the tutorial. Wrath of the Lightbringer is a great talent because it increases the damage of your Crusader Strike and Judgment by 100%, so it essentially doubles the damage of those abilities. And it also dramatically increases the critical strike chance of your Hammer of Wrath spell. Reckoning is another great protection paladin tanking talent. The reason why I only spent 1 talent point here is because in my particular talent build, I wanted the increased movement speed over in the retribution tree, as you can see there. But what Reckoning does is anytime you block, you have a 10% chance to cause your next attack to generate an additional attack. So it's nice for generating a little tiny bit of extra threat. Shield of the Righteous is another essential pally tanking ability that consumes all of your holy power charges to do damage on a single target. This ability generates a ton of threat, and we'll talk about how it fits into the single target rotation later in the tutorial. Grand Crusader is one of your proc abilities. It procs off of your Crusader Strike or Hammer of the Righteous and refreshes the cooldown on your next Avenger's Shield. We'll talk about how Grand Crusader fits into the AoE and the single target rotations later. Holy Shield is another essential protection paladin tanking ability. It increases the amount your shield blocks by an additional 20% for 10 seconds. So, in other words, normally when you block an attack, it mitigates 30% of the damage. When you have Holy Shield active, it mitigates 50% of the damage. Guardian of the Light is a pretty awesome talent. It has a couple of benefits. One is that it increases the effectiveness of your Word of Glory by 10% when you use it on yourself. The other interesting property is that anytime you receive overhealing, it'll create a protective shield equal to the amount of overhealing, and it lasts for 6 seconds. It's a really nice little perk to have. Divine Guardian is a nice defensive ability that you can use. It affects your entire party. It reduces the damage by 20%, which is okay, and it lasts for about 6 seconds. Sacred Duty is a pretty nice talent to have. It gives your Judgment and Avenger's Shield cast a 50% chance of making your next Shield of the Righteous crit. For this reason, it can be a smart idea to use Judgment and Avenger's Shield right before you plan on using Shield of the Righteous. And we'll talk about how you can do this in the single target rotation opener later in the tutorial. Shield of the Templar is a really awesome protection pally talent. It does a couple of things. One, it reduces the cooldowns on Avenging Wrath by 1 minute and Guardian of Ancient Kings by 2 minutes. But more importantly, what it does is anytime you cast Divine Plea, it'll automatically generate 3 holy power charges. We'll talk about how this talent fits into your single target rotation opener later in the tutorial. And the last talent we want to talk about is Ardent Defender. It does a couple of things. One, it reduces the damage you take by 20% for 10 seconds. The other thing it does is while the Ardent Defender buff is active, any potential attack that would otherwise kill you, instead causes you to be healed for 15% of your maximum health. It used to be the way Ardent Defender worked, it would automatically proc when you died, which means that it was sort of a excessively easy talent. I mean, if you didn't even have to use it, it was just a little bit too overpowered. Now you actually have to strategically use it, which is nice. And that wraps up our protection paladin talent discussion. Now we're going to move on to the AoE and single target rotations.